Empire of Blood. Episode 17. In the Name of Science. General Otozo Yamada, Imperial Japan, Manchuria and occupied China, 1944 to 1945. The document is handwritten in Japanese. It is dated 1949. Outside the building where it will be read into the trial record, the city of Khabarovsk sits in its Siberian winter, the temperature dropping below -30 degrees Celsius, the river frozen, the trees stripped, the sky the flat white of a cold that is not weather but climate. Not an event, but a condition, the baseline reality of existence at this longitude and latitude. Inside, the hearing room is heated. Men sit at long tables. There are judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, a translator working in both directions between Russian and Japanese, observers from the press. The architecture is Soviet institutional. High ceilings, the blonde wood paneling, the apparatus of official proceedings surrounding a process that is, whatever else it is, supposed to be a reckoning. It is a confession, not a confession extracted by torture, not a document produced under the kind of pressure that distorts testimony into fiction. It is, by every account of the tribunal that received it, a confession made with the flat, procedural calm of a man describing routine administrative work. The man who signed it had commanded the largest Japanese army in the field at the end of the Second World War. He is describing, in the measured language of military reporting, what his forces did in Manchuria and across occupied China in the years before the war ended. He is describing plague, specifically. So he is describing how Japanese aircraft dropped ceramic bombs packed with fleas over Chinese cities. The fleas were infected with Yersinia pestis, bubonic plague. The bomb casings were designed to shatter on impact at low altitude, releasing the fleas before the heat of the explosion could kill them. The fleas dispersed into the streets, into the markets, into the homes. The fleas fed, and the plague began. Let that sit for a moment. We are not talking about medieval Europe. We are not talking about the Black Death moving along trade routes through rat populations nobody understood, killing people who had no framework for comprehending what was happening to them. We are talking about 1940. We are talking about aeronautical engineers and microbiologists and military logistics officers sitting in offices and designing a delivery system for one of history's most terrible diseases and then deploying it against civilian populations. We are talking about a decision made at a desk by a man in a uniform who then signed his name to the operational order and went home for dinner. The city of Ningbo on the eastern coast of China received one of these attacks in October 1940. Within days of the attack, cases of bubonic plague appeared in the city. The disease spread outward. By the time the outbreak was controlled, more than 100 people were dead from an epidemic that had been deliberately engineered and deliberately delivered. 100 people who woke up that morning, who had plans and families and ordinary human lives, are dead because a military command somewhere decided that plague was a useful weapon. 100 people, and that was one city, one attack. The scale of what the Japanese biological warfare program did across China during the years of occupation runs to numbers that are still disputed, still being researched, still being denied in certain quarters, but that conservative historical estimates place in the tens of thousands of deaths directly attributable to deliberate biological attack, with total mortality from related programs and experiments likely reaching into the hundreds of thousands. The technology of it is worth pausing on, because we tend to imagine biological warfare as something either ancient, the medieval use of plague corpses catapulted over city walls, or futuristic, the stuff of late-century bioterrorism anxieties. But what happened in China in the late 1930s and early 1940s is something else. a rigorous, scientifically sophisticated, industrially scaled program of biological weapon development and deployment conducted by a modern nation-state with all the resources of modern organizational and scientific life behind it. The fleas were bred in quantity. The Yersinia pestis cultures were maintained at precise temperatures in proper laboratory conditions. The ceramic bomb casings were engineered to specific fragility specifications so that they would shatter at the right altitude without killing the contents. The aircraft were assigned, briefed, and flew on scheduled operational timetables. This was not improvised. This was a program. And programs require administrators. Programs require the organizational architecture of authority. The chain of command that links the laboratory bench to the operational briefing to the mission authorization to the signature on the order. Programs require, at their apex, a commanding officer who knows what the program is and decides that it will continue. The man who was that officer at the highest level the program reached was named Otozo Yamada. He was 63 years old when the war ended. He had spent his entire adult life in the Imperial Japanese Army. He had risen through every rank from second lieutenant to full general, acquiring along the way every decoration and mark of distinction that the Japanese military could bestow. He was, by the measure of the institution he had served, a success story. At the Khabarovsk War Crimes Tribunal in 1949, the Soviet prosecutors placed before him the documents, the operational orders, the laboratory reports, the field records from the units under his command. They placed before him the testimony of the scientists and the pilots and the logistics officers who had built and deployed and operated the machine. And they asked him to account for what had been done in his name, under his authority, by the forces he commanded. His defense was not that he didn't know. His defense was that he had been following the requirements of his position, that the programs he inherited were already running when he took command, that the logic of national necessity made resistance to them unthinkable, that the Imperial Japanese Army was a system, and he was a component of that system, and components of systems do not refuse to function. Remember that argument. Because by 1949, it was not a new argument. It had been made at Nuremberg 3 years earlier by men in German uniforms. It had been rejected there. It would be rejected at Khabarovsk too, but the fact that it was made, the fact that a man who had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers and presided over operations of deliberate mass death could sit in a courtroom and describe his role as purely administrative, purely systemic, purely the mechanical execution of institutional requirements. That fact deserves more than a verdict. It deserves examination. The argument has a specific seductiveness. It draws on something true, that large institutions do operate in ways that constrain the choices of their individual members, that a general commanding 1 million men does not personally design every policy or personally participate in every operation, that the weight of institutional culture and precedent and hierarchy genuinely limits what any individual within the institution can do. These things are true. The argument is not simply a lie. Where it fails every time it is made at Nuremberg and at Khabarovsk, and in every subsequent tribunal where soldiers and administrators and bureaucrats have tried to use it, is at the point of command authority. A person who has the authority to continue an atrocity has, by definition, the authority to stop it. The same signature that continues an operational order could stop it. The same command relationship that allows a general to order his forces to deploy plague bombs allows him to order them not to. So in the institutional framing, I was following the system's requirements, is a claim that the system's requirements had no alternative. It denies that the decision was a decision. It claims that the man at the desk was not a moral agent, but a mechanical relay, transmitting signals from one part of the system to another without the possibility of interception. This claim is false. It was false in 1949. The Soviets said so and sentenced Yamada to 25 years at hard labor, and they were right to do so. Who was this man? Not the general, not the war criminal, but the man, the child in Nagano Prefecture, the young cavalry officer learning his trade, the mid-career administrator absorbing the ideology of an empire whose specific, peculiar, and lethal version of nationalism was turning itself into one of the most violent state projects in human history. How does a person become capable of signing the orders? How does a system produce men who sign them without flinching? That is what this episode is about. Not the plague bombs themselves, though we will get to them. Not the trial, though we will get there too. The deeper question, the one that keeps this story alive and relevant in a world that has not stopped producing institutional violence, is the question of formation, of how a society manufactures the men it needs to do the things it needs done, and then, when it loses, discovers that it cannot entirely explain what it made. Stay with us, because the answer is more complicated than a monster and more terrifying than a madman. And to understand what Imperial Japan was doing in China and why it needed men like Otozo Yamada to do it, you have to go back to an island that was terrified. Japan in the mid-19th century was a country that had, for over 200 years, deliberately isolated itself from the world. The Tokugawa shogunate, the military government that had ruled Japan since 1603, had decided, with the certainty of men who had watched European powers methodically colonize their neighbors, that the safest response to the outside world was to close the door. Trade was tightly restricted, Christianity was banned, Japanese citizens were forbidden to leave, foreign ships were turned away from all but a handful of designated ports. The country turned inward, cultivated its own arts and culture and internal political arrangement, and then watched from behind its walls as the European powers built their empire. Then, in 1853, an American naval officer named Matthew Perry arrived in Tokyo Bay with 4 warships, 2 of them steam-powered, and delivered a letter demanding that Japan open its ports to American trade. The demand was backed by the obvious implication of the guns pointing at the city. Japan opened its ports. The specific experience of what the Japanese called the black ships, the dark hulls of the American steamers sitting in the harbor, smoke rising from their stacks, their cannon mouth visible from the shore, became one of the foundational national traumas of modern Japan. Not the worst thing that would ever happen to Japan. That was coming in August 1945 over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But perhaps the most formative, because it happened at the moment when national character was being made. It happened when Japan was deciding, under the most direct possible pressure, what kind of nation it would be. And what it decided, in the 20 years of turbulent domestic politics that followed Perry's arrival, was that the only way to never again stand helpless before a foreign fleet in your own harbor was to build a fleet more powerful than anything the foreigners could bring. This decision, and the national transformation it drove, is the foundation on which everything else in this episode is built, because the Japan that would produce Otozo Yamada and Unit 731 in the Three Alls policy in the biological warfare program was not a country that had always been this way. It was a country that had become this way through a specific historical process and under a specific kind of national pressure by making a series of choices that in retrospect can be seen as moving steadily toward catastrophe, but that at each step seemed, to the people making them, like the only rational responses to the situation they faced. This is important to hold in your mind as we move through this story. The Japanese military's crimes were not the expression of a timeless national character. They were the product of a specific historical conjuncture, a rapidly modernizing nation, a militarizing state, an ideology that had elevated military power to the status of sacred national purpose, and a set of beliefs about race and civilization and scientific progress that were shaped by the same intellectual currents as European imperialism, but that combined in Japan's specific context with particular and lethal force. And what followed was one of the most compressed and remarkable national transformations in human history. Japan looked at the world that Perry's ships represented, the world of industrial technology, of steam power and modern artillery, and professional standing armies organized on European lines, and made a collective decision that is almost unique in the record of nations under pressure. It decided to become that world, not to be colonized by it, not to resist it from behind preserved traditions, to become it as rapidly as possible, and then to use what it had become to ensure that nobody could ever again sail into its harbor with guns and make demands. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 ended the shogunate and placed formal authority with the Emperor Meiji. This was not simply a change of government, and it was the replacement of an entire governing ideology. The samurai class, which had dominated Japan for centuries, was dissolved. A modern conscript army, organized on Prussian lines and equipped with Western weapons, replaced the feudal military structure. Universities were built, railways were laid. A modern industrial economy was constructed with a speed that astonished Western observers. The transformation was deliberate, planned and executed with a focused national urgency that can only be understood in the context of the terror that produced it. The terror of a country that had looked at what Europe was doing in Asia and understood that it had to modernize or be devoured. By 1894, Japan was ready to demonstrate what it had become. It went to war with China over influence in Korea, and it won. Decisively, humiliatingly for China, and in a conflict that shocked European observers and announced to the world that there was a new power in Asia. The Treaty of Shimonoseki gave Japan Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, and control over Korea. It also gave Japan something less tangible but more important: the intoxicating certainty that transformation had worked, that the terrified island had become an empire. In 1905, Japan went to war with Russia and won again. The Russo-Japanese War was the first time a non-European nation had defeated a major European power in modern warfare, and its psychological impact on both Japan and the rest of Asia cannot be overstated. Japan had not only modernized, it had beaten the West at the West's own game. The Tsar's fleet was at the bottom of the Tsushima Strait. The Japanese Empire was recognized as a great power, and then the ideology caught up with the achievement. Here is the thing about rapid national transformations. They tend to produce, alongside their genuine achievements, a specific kind of ideological toxicity. The story a country tells itself about how it transformed is rarely the complicated truth. It is something simpler, more charged, more useful as a unifying force. Japan's story, as it developed through the late Meiji and Taisho periods and into the Showa period that would see the Second World War, was a story about destiny, about a divine nation with a unique racial and spiritual heritage that had been threatened by the outside world and had responded not just by surviving, but by achieving greatness. And that had both the right and the obligation to extend its civilizing influence across Asia, to the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This was the name given to the ideological framework that would justify Japanese imperialism in the years leading up to and through the Second World War. The name requires some attention because it was designed to be seductive, designed to present Japanese expansion as liberation rather than conquest. The argument went like this. Asia had been dominated by European powers for centuries. Britain in India, France in Indochina, the Netherlands in the East Indies, the United States in the Philippines. These were colonial arrangements that exploited Asian people and resources for the benefit of distant European capitals. Japan, an Asian nation, the only Asian nation strong enough to challenge the European powers, would liberate its Asian neighbors from European colonialism and build a new order in which Asian people governed themselves under Japanese leadership, and mutual prosperity was shared across the region. The argument was, on its surface, not entirely without internal logic. European colonialism in Asia was real and exploitative and had produced enormous human suffering. Japan was genuinely an Asian nation that had genuinely achieved independence from Western domination through its own efforts. What the argument omitted was what Japanese expansion actually looked like on the ground. What it looked like on the ground was the Nanjing Massacre. In December 1937, Japanese forces captured Nanjing, then the capital of the Republic of China, and what followed was 6 weeks of violence that contemporary observers, including Europeans and Americans living in the city who tried to establish safe zones for civilians, documented with horror and disbelief. The killing of prisoners of war and civilians, the mass rape of women and girls, the burning of neighborhoods, the bodies piled in the streets and thrown into the Yangtze River. Estimates of the death toll from the Nanjing Massacre, sometimes called the Rape of Nanjing, range from 100,000 to 300,000 people. The range exists because nobody was keeping orderly records. Nobody was counting. Think about that. An event that killed, by conservative estimates, 100,000 human beings in 6 weeks, and it sits in historical memory under a range of casualty figures with an uncertainty band of 200,000 people. Not because the evidence is thin, because the scale was so vast that even the most diligent witnesses could not enumerate it. The Nanjing Massacre was not an anomaly. It was an extreme expression of a policy. The policy was called the Three Alls. In Japanese, Sanko Sakusen. Kill all, burn all, loot all. It was a counterinsurgency doctrine applied in Chinese territories under Japanese occupation, and it meant what it said. Villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters or simply located in contested areas were to be destroyed entirely. The population killed, the buildings burned, the food and resources taken. It was a policy designed to deprive Chinese resistance forces of a population base by eliminating the population. It was implemented, systematically, across an enormous geography. The ideology that made this possible drew on several interlocking streams of thought, each of which deserves examination because each of them appears in different forms in the career and thinking of Otozo Yamada. The first was the specific Japanese militarist interpretation of Bushido. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was an ancient tradition in Japanese culture, a code of conduct for the samurai class that emphasized honor, loyalty, discipline, and acceptance of death. In its classical form, it was a sophisticated ethical system with many admirable qualities. In the hands of 20th century Japanese militarism, it was stripped of its ethical nuance and weaponized as an ideological tool. Loyalty to the emperor was the supreme virtue. Death in his service was the supreme achievement. Surrender was not merely defeat. It was a moral failure, the ultimate dishonor, something to be avoided at literally any cost. This transformed interpretation of Bushido had two consequences that are relevant to our story. First, it made Japanese soldiers fight with a ferocity and disregard for personal survival that their opponents found almost incomprehensible. Second, and more relevant here, it taught Japanese soldiers to regard enemy forces that surrendered, or civilians that did not actively resist, with a contempt that could easily slide into dehumanization. If dying for the emperor is the supreme virtue, then the man who surrenders rather than die is not just defeated. He is contemptible. He has failed the most basic moral test. And contemptible people, in the logic of a dehumanizing ideology, so do not require the protections extended to those who have passed the test. The doctrine also had an inward-facing dimension that is less often discussed, but equally important. The same logic that made surrender contemptible made complaint contemptible, made self-preservation contemptible, made any deviation from the absolute requirements of military duty contemptible. A soldier who reported that his unit was conducting atrocities, who refused an order to participate in the killing of prisoners, who expressed moral discomfort with the methods being used, that soldier was not being principled. He was being weak. He was failing the Bushido test as surely as if he had surrendered in the field. The ideology sealed itself against its own correction. The second stream was racial hierarchy. Japanese imperial ideology classified Asian peoples on a spectrum of civilization, with Japanese at the apex and the Chinese and other mainland Asian populations occupying a lower position, not fully dehumanized in the way that Nazi ideology dehumanized Jews, but regarded with a patronizing condescension that, under the pressures of war, could become something more lethal. The co-prosperity sphere's promise of Asian liberation was undermined at every point by this underlying conviction that the Japanese were uniquely fit to lead and that others were, at best, pupils in need of firm instruction. The specific contempt for Chinese people that ran through the Imperial Japanese military was not simply the ordinary chauvinism of one nation toward another. It had a historical dimension. China had been Japan's cultural teacher for centuries, and the source of much of Japan's writing system, its Buddhism, its early artistic traditions. Japan had learned from China, and then Japan had modernized while China remained, in the Japanese imperial perception, mired in the past. This created a specific psychological structure. The contempt of the student who has overtaken the teacher, the need to assert dominance over the culture from which you once learned, the compensatory violence of a relationship in which the power dynamic has been radically reversed, and the reversal is experienced as humiliation rather than triumph. None of this explains, in any moral sense, what was done in China. There is no psychological backstory that explains it in the sense of making it understandable as an inevitable product of historical forces. But understanding the specific character of the contempt, its roots in the particular dynamics of Sino-Japanese history, its relationship to Japan's own anxiety about its position in the modern world, is necessary for understanding why the violence took the forms it did, rather than other forms. The third stream was the specific and particularly lethal ideology of scientific nationalism. Japan's modernization had made science central to its national identity. Science had built the navy that sank the Russian fleet. Science had produced the industrial capacity that allowed a small island to project military power across a continent. Science was not merely a tool for Japan. It was a manifestation of national virtue, proof of the nation's fitness for greatness, and in the specific context of the military in the 1930s. This elevation of science produced a particularly catastrophic result: the conviction that scientific advancement in the service of military power was not merely permissible, but sacred. That to use the tools of modern biology, modern chemistry, modern medicine to develop weapons that could destroy the enemy was not a perversion of science, it was science's highest purpose. This is the intellectual and ideological soil from which Unit 731 grew. Unit 731 was the common name for the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. The name was a bureaucratic euphemism worthy of the worst traditions of institutional violence anywhere in history. The department did not purify water. It developed biological and chemical weapons using live human subjects. The unit was established in 1935 in a facility outside the city of Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Its first and primary commander was a man named Shiro Ishii, an army surgeon and microbiologist who combined genuine scientific ability with what can only be described as a complete absence of ethical restraint. Ishii's argument for human experimentation was, in its way, logically consistent given the premises of Japanese military nationalism. Animal models were insufficient for developing reliable biological weapons, ergo human subjects were required, ergo the procurement and use of human subjects was a military necessity, ergo the objection that using human subjects was morally impermissible was a sentimental obstacle to national survival that had to be overcome. The premises were monstrous. The logic followed from them. Ishii was not a marginal figure, not a rogue scientist operating outside official sanction. He had supporters and patrons in the army ministry in Tokyo. His program had been reviewed at senior levels and approved. The funding came from official military budget allocations. The unit's relationship to the mainstream of Japanese military medicine was, by the mid-1930s, well established. Unit 731's personnel attended the same military medical conferences as other army physicians, published in some of the same journals, maintained professional relationships with the broader medical establishment. This is worth emphasizing because there is a version of the Unit 731 story that frames Ishii as an exceptional aberration, a scientist whose personal pathology drove him to extremes that the system would not otherwise have reached. This version is false. Ishii was unusual in his personal energy and his willingness to push the program to its limits, but the program had institutional support, institutional resources, and institutional protection from the beginning. The system wanted what Ishii was providing. He was useful to it, which is why he continued to receive funding and personnel and operational authorization for more than a decade. The decision to build Unit 731, made somewhere in the Army Ministry in the early 1930s, was made by men who understood what they were building. They understood that a biological warfare research program using human subjects was a program that would produce mass atrocity. They made the decision anyway. They made it because the ideology of scientific nationalism had provided them with a framework in which the decision was not only permissible, but obligatory. National survival required it. The emperor required it. The destiny of Japan required it. Under Ishii and his successors, Unit 731 conducted experiments on prisoners that included exposure to plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and other diseases. Vivisection performed without anesthesia. Frostbite experiments. Pressure experiments. Experiments on the effectiveness of flamethrowers against human flesh. The records that survived, and many were destroyed before the Soviet capture of Manchuria in August 1945, document thousands of deaths in the facility alone. The victims were referred to in the internal documentation of the unit as maruta, the Japanese word for logs. Logs. Say that is where this empire's ideology arrived, at its terminus. not at some accidental cruelty produced by the fog of war, at a laboratory, with a name for its victims that removed them from the category of human beings and placed them in the category of raw material. Scientific raw material. The Empire's scientific destiny, expressed in the bodies of people who had been kidnapped from their villages and who died strapped to tables in a building outside Harbin while researchers made notes. This is the empire that Otozo Yamada spent his entire adult life serving. This is the system of belief and institutional practice and ideological justification that formed him. And now we need to understand how it formed him, specifically who he was, where he came from, and how the man in the Nagano prefecture became the general who signed the orders. And Nagano prefecture in 1881 was a world of mountains and rice paddies, of cold winters, and a provincial life organized around the rhythms of agriculture and the social hierarchies of a Japan still in the early, turbulent decades of its transformation. The Meiji Restoration was 13 years old. The samurai class had been formally abolished 7 years earlier. The modern conscript army had been established 9 years earlier. The railway network was still sparse. The telegraph lines were new. The newspapers were beginning to carry dispatches about Japan's position in the world, about the Western powers, about the debates taking place in Tokyo over what it meant to be a modern nation. It was the world a child absorbed through the ambient noise of adult conversation, through the political weather of a country still deciding what it was becoming. Nagano prefecture itself, landlocked, mountainous, colder than the coastal cities, had a particular character in the Meiji period. It was a prefecture of strong agricultural communities, of mulberry cultivation and silk production, of people who worked hard in difficult terrain and who carried, in the regional culture, a certain directness and physical endurance that the local historians of the period liked to connect to the prefecture's samurai tradition. Whether or not the connection was accurate, it was part of the self-understanding of the place. Of proud, martial, disciplined provincial culture being absorbed into the national project of a Japan that was rapidly militarizing. Into this world, on November 20th, 1881, a boy was born who would spend his entire adult life in service of that national project. His name was Otozo Yamada. We do not know the precise texture of his childhood. The historical record of Yamada's early years is thin, as it is for most military men of his generation, who left behind military records and official biographical materials, but rarely the kind of personal correspondence and diary entries that allow historians to reconstruct a private self. What we know is the structure, the family, the prefecture, the educational path, the institutional choices. And from the institutional choices, we can read something about the man. What the institutional choices tell us is this. From his earliest adult decision, the decision to pursue a military career, to seek entry to the Army Academy, and to commit his life to the institution that was at that moment the most prestigious and powerful in Japan, Yamada chose the system. Not in the sense of a cynical calculation about where power lay, though power was certainly there, but in a deeper sense. The choice to put on the uniform was the choice to become the kind of person the uniform made. And the uniform in Imperial Japan in the first decade of the 20th century made a very specific kind of person, the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. Yamada entered the Army Academy in 1903 at the age of 21. This was 2 years before the Russo-Japanese War. He was a young man entering a military institution at the precise historical moment when Japanese militarism was in its ascendant phase, when the army was the engine of national greatness, as when a military career was not merely honorable, but was perceived as one of the central means by which a young man of modest provincial background could participate in the national project. The Army Academy was competitive and demanding, a place that shaped not just military skills, but a specific, carefully cultivated worldview. Its graduates were not simply soldiers. They were bearers of an institutional culture that linked personal discipline, loyalty to the emperor, and national destiny into a single, seamless ideology. The physical experience of the Army Academy deserves some attention. Young men who entered its gates in the early years of the 20th century were entering a world of total institutional control. A world in which every hour was scheduled, every activity prescribed, so every relationship mediated by the hierarchy of rank and seniority. This is not unusual for military academies. What was specific about the Japanese Army Academy was the ideological content of the total institution. The training was not simply about producing competent officers. It was about producing a specific kind of man. A man who understood his own identity as inseparable from his institutional role, who experienced loyalty to the emperor and to the army as the deepest expression of his own character rather than as an external constraint on it. The psychology of this kind of institutional formation is well documented. When an institution successfully fuses personal identity with institutional role, so the result is a person who is not merely loyal, but constitutively loyal, who cannot imagine questioning the institution's purposes without it feeling like a questioning of the self. The young men who came out of the Army Academy and went into cavalry regiments and staff colleges and administrative positions in the following decades were, in this sense, made rather than simply trained. The institution reached into the formation of selfhood and shaped it. Yamada graduated and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the cavalry in 1905, the year Japan defeated Russia. His entire professional formation happened against the backdrop of that extraordinary victory, of the national confidence it produced, of the sense that Japan's military system was not merely functional but world-class, so that the investment in military professionalism had paid off in the most dramatic possible way. This is formative context of a very specific kind. The young officer who learns his trade in the aftermath of a stunning national victory absorbs, almost inevitably, a set of assumptions about the institution he serves and the ideology it embodies. The assumptions are: the system works, the ideology is right, the methods are vindicated. Whatever this institution requires of me is worth doing, because the institution produces results that justify the requirements. Yamada spent the years between 1905 and the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 doing what military officers of his generation did: climbing. He served as a cavalry officer. He became an instructor. He attended the Army Staff College, the path for officers being groomed for senior command. He was promoted steadily through the ranks: captain, major, lieutenant colonel, colonel, major general. He served in administrative and command positions that took him through the various layers of the Japanese military bureaucracy. These years, the long middle years of a military career between early service and senior command, are the years that most biographies of generals tend to treat as preparation, as prelude, as the necessary but relatively uninteresting development phase before the dramatic events of senior command. This is, I want to argue, a mistake, because the long middle years are precisely where the character is made, or rather, where the character the institution wants is either accepted or resisted, and where the officer makes, hundreds of times in small ways, and the choice of which kind of man he's going to be. In Yamada's case, the choices he made were consistently, durably, entirely in the direction of the institution. This is not a criticism of him as an individual in isolation. The pressure to conform in the Imperial Japanese Army of the 1930s was not the ordinary professional pressure of career advancement. though that was certainly real. It was something more total, more invasive, more connected to identity at the deepest level. The Japanese military culture of the period made institutional loyalty not merely a professional requirement, but a moral absolute. To question the army's methods was to question its ideology. To question its ideology was to question the emperor's divine authority. To question the emperor's divine authority was, and this is not metaphor, this is how it was understood, not merely insubordination or sedition, but sacrilege. In this context, the officers who resisted, who raised ethical objections to specific operations, who expressed discomfort with the methods being employed, who tried to create distance between themselves and the worst of what the army was doing, paid very high prices. Some were transferred, some were passed over for promotion, some were subjected to formal punishment, some were assassinated. The 1930s saw a series of incidents in which young nationalist officers killed or attempted to kill senior military and political figures they considered insufficiently committed to the militarist project. The atmosphere was one in which the cost of dissent was made unmistakably clear. The February 26th incident of 1936 is the most dramatic example. So a group of young army officers, believing that certain senior politicians and military men were failing the emperor by not pursuing militarist policies vigorously enough, organized an attempted coup. They assassinated several senior officials, occupied government buildings in Tokyo, and held the capital in a state of chaos for 4 days before being suppressed. The leaders were executed, but the effect on the Japanese army's political culture was not simply that the coup had failed. The effect was that it demonstrated viscerally what radical nationalism was capable of, and it intimidated moderate voices in the military and government into silence or complicity. After February 1936, the space for internal dissent in the Japanese military effectively closed. The generals who remained in command were those who had demonstrated sufficient ideological reliability to survive the political pressure. Yamada was among them. He had demonstrated, through his long career of faithful institutional service, that he was not a man who would cause trouble. He was not a man who would raise uncomfortable questions. He was not a man who would look at what his army was doing in China and write a report to his superiors expressing concern about compliance with the laws of war. He was a man who would do his job. Yamada did not dissent. His promotion to general in 1940 marked his arrival at the highest tier of the Japanese military command. By this point, the war with China had been ongoing for 3 years. The Nanjing massacre was 3 years in the past, and the Three Alls policy was in operation across large areas of occupied China. Unit 731 had been operational for 5 years, conducting its experiments and beginning to deploy biological weapons in the field. The biological attacks in Zhejiang province in 1940, the ones that included the Ningbo attack, were underway. Yamada was on the Supreme War Council. He was Inspector General of Military Training. He was at the center of the military establishment, absorbing its priorities and participating in its deliberations. He knew, in the way that senior commanders always know, what was happening in the field. Not necessarily every detail, not the specific names and faces, but the shape of it, the policies, the methods, the scale. Senior commanders in functioning military bureaucracies are not ignorant of what their subordinates are doing. So they are briefed. They read the operational reports. They attend the planning sessions. They sign off on budget allocations and personnel decisions. What Yamada did with this knowledge was continue his climb. In 1944, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. The Kwantung Army. It is worth pausing here to understand what this appointment meant. because the Kwantung Army was not simply a large military formation. It was, in the context of Japanese imperial ideology, one of the most symbolically and operationally significant forces in the entire war. The Kwantung Army was the force that had effectively created the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1931 through a campaign of manipulation and staged provocations that its own officers had engineered against the wishes of the civilian government in Tokyo. And it was the force that had won enormous autonomy for itself through a series of military successes and diplomatic maneuvers. It was, by the time Yamada took command, in some ways more powerful than the government ostensibly directing it. At its height, the Kwantung Army had numbered close to 1 million men. By 1944, when Yamada took command, that number was being drawn down as the war in the Pacific consumed resources and the strategic situation deteriorated. But the Kwantung Army still controlled Manchuria, an enormous territory containing vast coal and iron resources, a substantial industrial base, and millions of Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, and Japanese inhabitants. It controlled the puppet government of Manchukuo. It controlled the railways and the telegraph lines and the administrative apparatus that had been built, and over 13 years of occupation on top of the existing Chinese infrastructure. And embedded within its command structure, in a facility outside Harbin that was officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, and unofficially understood by everyone who mattered to be something very different, was Unit 731. Yamada knew about Unit 731 before he took command. This is not speculation. The unit's operations were known to the senior levels of the military command. Its commander reported up the chain. Its budget came from military appropriations. Its activities were, within the classified universe of Japanese military planning, not a secret from the men who commanded the forces of which it was a part. When Yamada took command of the Kwantung Army in July 1944, he became the commanding officer of the organizational structure that contained Unit 731. He was briefed on its operations. He reviewed its status. He made decisions about its continued operation. He was, in the clear language of military command authority, responsible for what it did. He continued to let it operate. There is a psychological question here that deserves direct engagement, because it is the question that sits at the center of Yamada's story and of stories like it. How does a man live with this? Not in a moral sense. We will get to the moral accounting. In a purely psychological sense, how does a person integrate into their self-image the knowledge that they command a unit that kidnaps human beings and kills them in laboratories for military research? The answer, based on everything we know about how people in similar positions have processed similar knowledge, is compartmentalization. And the specific form that compartmentalization takes in a military context is the language of duty, of necessity, of institutional authority. The unit exists because it has been authorized by the chain of command. Its work serves the national interest. The decision to establish it was made above my level. My role is to command, to administer, to ensure that the military mission is achieved. The moral questions were resolved at a level above me when the unit was created. This is not rationalization in the crude sense of making excuses. It is something more systematic. The complete transformation of moral agency into institutional role. I'm not a person making a moral choice. I'm a commander executing a military mission. The mission is defined above me. My responsibility is execution, not evaluation. Evaluation happens at the policy level. I operate at the command level. This division between the policy level, where moral choices are made, and the operational level, where they are executed, is one of the most durable and most dangerous fictions in the psychology of institutional violence. It is the fiction that allows the people who execute the policies to consider themselves morally unimplicated in their consequences. It is the fiction that Yamada would invoke at Khabarovsk 4 years later, when Soviet prosecutors asked him to account for the deaths. By the time Yamada took command of the Kwantung Army, for he had spent 40 years in a military institution that had systematically trained him to think in exactly this way. He was not a sadist. There is no evidence in his biography of personal cruelty or of any particular enthusiasm for violence. He was an administrator, a professional, a man who had mastered the management of large and complex military organizations. He was efficient, orderly, loyal to his chain of command, attentive to the requirements of his position. He was exactly what the institution had built him to be. That was the problem, because the institution had also, over the same 40 years, built into him a set of assumptions about the people on the other end of its operations, the Chinese civilians and prisoners, the laborers in Manchuria, the human subjects in the Unit 731 facilities, that made them, at the level of operational decision-making, not quite fully real, not quite fully human in the specific, irreducible sense that human beings are human when you can see their faces and hear their voices and understand that they have the same interior life you do. The ideology had done its work, the training had done its work, the institutional culture had done its work. The men in the laboratories were logs. The general commanding the army that ran the laboratories had a clean desk and orderly papers and a grasp of military logistics that his superiors considered impressive. He was doing his job. There is one more dimension of Yamada, the man that requires attention, before we move into the machinery, he commanded. His relationship to the specific moment in the war when he took command. Because 1944 was not a good time to take command of anything in the Imperial Japanese military. By mid-1944, Japan was losing the war. The island-hopping campaign in the Pacific had systematically dismantled Japan's island defenses and was moving steadily toward the home islands. The bombing of Japanese cities had begun. The industrial capacity that had powered Japan's early conquests was being strangled by American submarine warfare against supply lines. The army in China was still capable of major offensive operations. The Ichi-Go offensive of 1944 was one of the largest Japanese military operations of the entire war. But the strategic situation was irreversible. Everyone at the senior levels of the military knew this. Not officially, not in the statements made to the public or even in many of the internal communications, but at the level of private strategic reality. And here is where Yamada's story intersects with something larger than his biography. Because the way the Japanese military responded to impending defeat tells you something essential about what this particular ideology produced. Something that goes beyond the usual calculus of military desperation. The Japanese military did not, in the face of impending defeat, begin to look for a negotiated settlement that would preserve as many lives as possible. It doubled down. It intensified. It planned for the defense of the home islands, a strategy called Ketsu-Go. A plan that called for the mobilization of the entire civilian population, including children as combatants, and for a defense so costly in allied lives that a negotiated settlement could be extracted. It continued the biological weapons program. It continued the experiments. It continued the Three Alls operations in China. It planned kamikaze attacks and other suicide operations at a scale that treated the lives of its own soldiers as expendable raw material. Ketsu-Go projected Allied casualties in an invasion of the Japanese home islands at somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million Allied deaths, with Japanese military and civilian casualties that the planners themselves estimated could reach into the tens of millions. The planners proposed this with apparent equanimity. The ideology of Bushido had been so thoroughly internalized that the prospect of a national death, not metaphorical, but the literal physical death of a very large proportion of the Japanese population in defense of the home islands, was not only contemplated, but planned for. Dying for the emperor at national scale was preferable to the dishonor of defeat. This is the ideological conclusion of the trajectory that began with the black ships in Tokyo Bay and ran through the Meiji Restoration and the Russo-Japanese War and the conquest of Manchuria and the Nanjing Massacre and Unit 731 and the biological warfare program. The ideology consumed itself. The machine that had been built to protect Japan from the terrifying outside world had produced a logic that was willing to sacrifice Japan entirely in the service of its own principles. Yamada was part of this command culture in this moment with these priorities, commanding this army, as when the Soviet Union entered the Pacific War in August 1945 with the largest armored offensive in history, the Kwantung Army, supposedly Japan's most powerful field force, collapsed in days. Yamada surrendered to the Soviets on August 19, 1945. He was 53 years old. He had given everything the empire asked of him. He had climbed every rung. He had commanded the command, and now he was a prisoner. His name was Otozo Yamada, and the dead he commanded the machinery to create are still waiting for something like a full accounting. What comes next is the reckoning, and the reckoning was not complete. But before we get to the trial, before we get to the verdict, we need to understand in detail exactly what he commanded. We need to go inside the machine, and the machine, when you see it clearly, will not leave you. There is a building in Harbin, China. It was built in the 1930s when Harbin was under Japanese occupation, when Manchuria had been transformed into the puppet state of Manchukuo. The building and its surrounding facilities covered an area of 6 square kilometers. It had its own power generation, its own water supply, its own airfield. It had laboratories, operating rooms, animal holding facilities, prisoner cells, and an incinerator. At its height, it employed somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 personnel, scientists, military officers, engineers, nurses, guards, administrators. It was, from a logistical standpoint, an impressive facility. It was a death factory. The organizational name was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, Unit 731. And the formal name was used in external communications, in budget requests to the military ministry in Tokyo, in the paperwork that connected it to the broader structure of Japanese military administration. In internal communications and in the testimony of the people who worked there, it was simply Unit 731, or sometimes in the darkest shorthand, just the unit. Understanding how Unit 731 functioned requires understanding it at 3 levels: the scientific, the logistical, and the command. And I want to take each of these in turn because the horror of it is not only in the individual acts, terrible as those are, but in the way the system worked as a whole, the way its various components fitted together to produce industrialized atrocity. At the scientific level, the unit's primary mission was the development of biological weapons capable of being deployed in field conditions. This sounds abstract. It was not abstract. It meant identifying which disease agents were most suitable for weaponization, developing methods for culturing those agents in large quantities, developing delivery systems that would allow them to be dispersed over populations, testing those delivery systems in field conditions to assess their effectiveness, refining the agents and delivery systems based on field results, Each of these activities required what the scientists called research subjects, living human beings. The reasoning, as Shiro Ishii and his team had worked it out, was that animal models were inadequate for developing reliable human biological weapons. The immune systems of animals differ from human immune systems. Disease progression in animals does not reliably predict disease progression in humans. Effective weaponized biological agents needed to be tested on humans to establish accurate dosing, transmission rates, and lethality curves. This was the scientific rationale. This was how the scientists talked to themselves and to each other about what they were doing. Let us be specific about what this looked like. Prisoners, referred to in documents as maruta, logs, were brought to Unit 731 from multiple sources. The main supplier was the Kempei Tai, the Japanese military police, which operated a system of prisoner procurement throughout occupied Manchuria and China. Civilians arrested on suspicion of being enemy agents or sympathizers, prisoners of war, as people who had simply been in the wrong place when a sweep operation was conducted. The prisoners were transported to the facility, processed and given identifying numbers, and assigned to different research programs. Some were infected with plague, deliberately, through injections or through exposure to infected fleas, to study disease progression. Some were infected with cholera, with typhoid, with anthrax. Some were exposed to frostbite, immersed in ice water, or left outside in Manchurian winter temperatures, while researchers measured the rate of tissue death and tested various treatment methods. Some were subjected to what the researchers called pressure experiments, placed in hyperbaric chambers with pressure increased until blood vessels burst. Some were used in studies of conventional weapons, tied to stakes at measured distances from explosive charges, while researchers documented the effect of blast waves on the human body. The frostbite experiments deserve their own description because they illustrate something specific about the methodology. Manchurian winters are extreme, temperatures regularly dropping below -40 degrees Celsius, conditions in which exposed flesh freezes in minutes. Japanese military medicine was interested in treating frostbite because Japanese soldiers fighting in Manchuria and northern China suffered from it regularly. The research need was real. The research approach was to take prisoners, expose them to extreme cold under controlled conditions, and document the progression of frostbite and the effectiveness of various treatment methods. And prisoners were stripped to the waist and led outside in winter temperatures. Their arms were immersed in water at near-freezing temperatures until the limbs began to freeze. Then they were brought inside and different rewarming methods were tried. Warm water, open fire, body heat from another person. The results were documented. The experiment was repeated on different subjects because the ones who survived the first round were often too damaged for further use, and because the research program required control groups and consistent experimental conditions and the kind of sample size that provided statistical confidence in the results. The people conducting these experiments were physicians, men with medical degrees, with training in physiology and biochemistry and clinical medicine, and who understood exactly what they were doing and exactly what their subjects were experiencing. They had taken, in many cases, the oath that begins with, "First, do no harm." They had studied at Japanese universities that were part of the international scientific community. They read the same journals as their counterparts in Europe and the United States. They were not uneducated, not primitive, not operating in ignorance of the ethical standards that the medical profession had developed over centuries. They knew, and they continued. The surgical experiments were the most visible expression of what the ideology of scientific nationalism had produced when stripped of all ethical constraint. Subjects were operated on without anesthesia, the justification being, as noted, that anesthesia would compromise the physiological data. For procedures ranging from organ removal to limb amputation, to the injection of air into the bloodstream, to the deliberate introduction of disease agents directly into the organs. The operations were performed by trained surgeons following standard surgical protocols in terms of technique, while violating every principle that gave those protocols their meaning. Some prisoners underwent surgery without anesthesia. This was not surgical sadism for its own sake, or not entirely. It was, in the institutional framing of the unit, research into surgical techniques that might be useful in battlefield medicine. And the logic required the anesthesia to be withheld because, according to the researcher's justification, anesthesia affected physiological responses in ways that would compromise the research data. The patients needed to be conscious and unanesthetized for the results to be scientifically valid. Think about what is being said here. There is a scientific argument being made. The scientific argument requires a conclusion that involves conscious human beings experiencing surgery without pain control. And the institution accepted this argument. Accepted it, funded it, staffed it, provided the subjects for it, received the results from it, incorporated those results into military medical doctrine. Nobody in the command chain said no. Now let us move to the second level, the logistics. A Unit 731 was not a secret in the sense of being unknown to the Japanese military command. Its existence and general purpose were known at the senior command levels. Its funding came from the military budget, authorized by the Army Ministry in Tokyo. Its output, the biological agents and delivery systems it developed, was used in operations that required coordination between the unit's scientists, the Japanese Air Force, and the operational command in China. The operational deployments of biological weapons are documented in the Khabarovsk trial records and in subsequent historical research. The operations in China included multiple instances of aircraft dropping plague-infected materials over Chinese cities and military positions. The Ningbo attack in 1940 is one of the better documented. Fleas infected with plague were dropped over the city, and cases of bubonic plague appeared within days. Operations in Zhejiang and Henan provinces involved the deliberate contamination of water sources and food supplies with cholera and typhoid. There is evidence of operations in which plague-infected materials were introduced into Chinese nationalist supply lines. Each of these operations required multiple levels of military coordination. The unit needed to produce the agents and the delivery systems. The Air Force needed to provide aircraft and crews. The operational command needed to identify targets and authorize the missions. Logistics needed to handle transport, timing, and coordination. Intelligence needed to provide target assessment. Each of these levels had names. Each of these levels had officers who signed authorizations and wrote operational orders and coordinated with their counterparts in other branches. The pilots who flew the missions knew what they were dropping. Some of them, not all. The compartmentalization of military operations means that some participants know only their piece. The pilot who drops the container may be told only that it is a dispersion device for a classified payload, without being told the specific nature of the payload. But at the planning and authorization level, the people coordinating the operations knew precisely what was being done, and above all of them was the command. Which brings us to the third level, command authority, and specifically what it means that Yamada commanded this army. Military command authority is not a passive relationship. A commander is not merely a titular figurehead who lends his name to operations conducted by his subordinates. Military law and the common understanding of what command responsibility means holds that a commander is responsible for knowing what his forces are doing and for ensuring that what they do complies with the laws of war. This responsibility is not discharged simply by not personally observing the violations. It requires active oversight. It requires inquiry. It requires that a commander who knows or should have known of violations by his forces take action to stop them and to punish those responsible. Yamada knew. The documentary record is clear that he was briefed on Unit 731's operations after taking command. The trial record includes testimony that he attended briefings on the unit's activities and signed operational authorizations that covered the unit's work. He was not ignorant of what was happening. He was the commanding general of an army that operated a death factory, and he exercised his command authority over that army for the duration of his command. What did he do with that authority? He did not shut down Unit 731. He did not order a review of its operations. He did not refer the question of its compliance with the laws of war to any legal authority within the Japanese military. Though the Japanese military's legal framework for the laws of war was, it must be said, not robustly enforced in any case. He continued to authorize the operational deployments of biological weapons. He signed the orders that were placed before him, and he received the briefings and the reports. He exercised his command in the way that his entire professional life had trained him to exercise command, by managing a large organization efficiently, by ensuring that its various components functioned in coordination, by meeting the operational requirements set by the chain of command above him. There is a specific document that illustrates this, a briefing document prepared for Yamada shortly after he took command, summarizing the operational activities and research priorities of the Kwantung Army's various specialized units. Unit 731's entry in this document describes its research programs in the clinical language of military science: pathogen cultivation, vector research, field testing. The language does not describe what is actually happening. The language describes a research program. Yamada received this document. He acknowledged it. He noted the unit's operational status in his subsequent reports to the Army General Staff in Tokyo. He was 63 years old. He had been a soldier for 40 years. He had done his duty. The machine ran. What is remarkable, looking at the command record, is not the presence of explicit authorizations for specific atrocities, though some exist in the trial record, but the absence of any record of questioning, any record of Yamada asking his staff to justify the program's methods, any record of a request for legal review, any record of a communication to Tokyo expressing concern about the ethical or legal status of what was happening in the Harbin facility. The silence in the record is itself a record. The absence of any trace of moral inquiry. When a man with direct command authority over a program of industrialized human experimentation is not an administrative coincidence. It is the operational expression of an ideology that had, over 40 years, successfully replaced moral inquiry with institutional loyalty. There is a specific moment in the operation of the machine that deserves to be held as clearly as possible, because it concentrates into a single image what the whole architecture of institutional violence produces. The moment is this: a prisoner in Unit 731, a person who was a farmer or a merchant or a teacher before he was arrested and transported to Harbin, is lying on an operating table in a facility that has been bureaucratically organized, administratively authorized, scientifically staffed, logistically supported, and in command authorized by a chain of officers whose names are in the record. The researcher who is about to begin the procedure has a degree from a Japanese university. He has colleagues who respect him. He has a family. He will go home tonight and eat dinner. and he is about to do something to the person on the table that cannot be described without clinical precision, because clinical precision is the only way to describe it without either flinching away from it or sensationalizing it. The institutional machinery that produced this moment did not require any of its components to understand themselves as committing atrocity. The researchers understood themselves as scientists conducting necessary research in service of national security. The logistics officers understood themselves as supply professionals, ensuring that research materials arrived on schedule. The commanding officers understood themselves as administrators, managing a military organization in the service of the emperor. Nobody in the chain was the monster. The monster was the chain, and Yamada, at the top of the chain, was its most senior administrator. When August 1945 arrived and the Soviet armies crossed the border and the Kwantung Army began its final collapse, the unit destroyed what evidence it could. The prisoners who remained in the facilities were killed to prevent them from testifying. The animals were killed. The records were burned. The researchers dispersed. Ishii, the unit's long-time commander, made his way back to Japan, where he would eventually negotiate immunity from American prosecution in exchange for sharing his research data, a deal that is one of the most ethically grotesque decisions the American occupation authorities made in the entire post-war period, and a decision that has permanently stained the historical record of how justice was served, or not served, in the aftermath of what Unit 731 did. Yamada did not negotiate immunity. Yamada surrendered to the Soviets and went to a prison camp in Siberia. And 4 years later, in the winter of 1949 in the city of Khabarovsk, he sat in a Soviet courtroom and answered questions. The machine tried to erase itself. It did not entirely succeed. Not because the document survived, many did not, but because the people who had seen it, who had experienced it, and who had been inside it and come out the other side, remembered. Because memory is harder to kill than paper, and the testimony would come. Slowly, painfully, across decades it would come. The Khabarovsk war crimes trial opened on December 25th, 1949. The timing was not accidental. The Soviets were conducting political theater as well as judicial proceedings, and they wanted the Western world, particularly the Americans, who had just granted immunity to many of the Unit 731 personnel in exchange for research data, to understand that they, the Soviets, were serious about accountability. The trial ran for 5 days and prosecuted 12 Japanese defendants, including Yamada and several of his subordinates from Unit 731 and other biological warfare operations. The proceedings were careful and documented, and unlike the more politically fraught elements of some post-war tribunals, the Khabarovsk trial had substantial physical evidence, surviving documents, laboratory equipment, field records, and, crucially, the testimony of multiple defendants who admitted in detail what had been done. Some historians have suggested that Soviet pressure produced false confessions. This is possible, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging it. But the problem with this argument is that the confessions align with physical evidence and with subsequent historical research that is confirmed, rather than undermined their basic accuracy. The biological weapons operations happened. The human experiments happened. The documents corroborate the testimony. The testimony corroborates the documents. Yamada received a sentence of 25 years at hard labor. He served 11 years. The Soviet Union released him in 1956 as part of a broader diplomatic accommodation with Japan. He returned to Japan. He was 64 years old, in declining health, with a military career and a war behind him that had ended in Soviet captivity and a war crimes conviction. He lived for 9 more years. He died in 1965 at the age of 83 in Japan. He died at home. This is worth noting, not as a score-settling observation, but as a fact about what accountability looked like in the specific legal and political context of the Cold War, aftermath of the Second World War. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, prosecuted Japanese leaders for Class A war crimes, crimes against peace, and essentially the political and military decisions that led to aggressive war. It executed 7 men and imprisoned others, but it did not address Unit 731 because the American decision to grant immunity to Unit 731 researchers meant that the most detailed evidence of biological warfare and human experimentation could not be introduced without implicating American intelligence who had negotiated for that evidence. The result was a selective accountability. The men who had planned the aggressive wars were tried. The men who had run the death factory largely were not. At least not by the tribunal that had the most moral authority to try them. Yamada was tried and convicted, but by the Soviets, in proceedings that were credible but were also political, in a context that gave them less historical legitimacy than they deserved. And the American immunity deal deserves more detailed examination than it typically receives, because it is not a footnote. It is a central fact about how the post-war world chose to handle the evidence of what Unit 731 did, and it has consequences that run forward to the present. The deal was initiated by officers in the American Occupation Administration who were, by 1945 and 1946, already thinking about the Cold War rather than the just concluded Hot War. The Soviet Union had captured Manchuria and had access to whatever physical evidence remained of the biological warfare program. The United States wanted the research data that Unit 731 had compiled. Years of human experimentation on plague, cholera, typhoid, and other agents. Data that the American biowarfare research establishment believed could not have been ethically obtained in any other way, and that would advance American biological weapons development. General Shiro Ishii was approached. He negotiated. He provided his data. He received immunity from prosecution. He returned to civilian life. He reportedly operated a clinic in Tokyo in the post-war years. He died in 1959 of throat cancer, having never been formally prosecuted for anything. The data he provided was incorporated into American biological warfare research. The American Biological Warfare Program, which had been active during the war and continued in various forms through the Cold War, benefited from what had been done in the Unit 731 facilities. This is not a comfortable fact. It implicates the victorious power in the atrocity it had defeated. It means that the deaths in Harbin produced research outputs that were then used by the country that was simultaneously prosecuting Nuremberg. It means that the ethical claim that the Allied powers were fighting for something better than what they had defeated was, in this specific case, partially hollow. The scientists of Unit 731, the researchers, the doctors, the men who had stood at the tables, mostly went home. Many returned to careers in medicine, in pharmaceutical research, in the Japanese medical establishment. Some achieved professional distinction. Some died in comfortable circumstances, having never been publicly named in connection with what they had done. This is one of the most disturbing legacies of the Unit 731 story, and it requires more than a passing acknowledgement. The scientists who conducted human experiments went home. They built careers. Some of them, eventually, spoke about what they had done. Not in the context of criminal accountability, But in the context of historical documentation, often decades later, often when prosecution was no longer possible, their testimony, when it came, was matter-of-fact, clinical, often devoid of the emotional weight that we expect from confessions of atrocity. They described the work the way a doctor describes a procedure, with the language of professional practice, with the implicit assumption that their interlocutors will understand the institutional context that made the work necessary. Some of them expressed regret, some did not. Now, the ones who expressed regret often framed it in terms of the suffering the experiments caused, rather than in terms of their own moral culpability. The regret of a professional who had to do something difficult, rather than the remorse of a person who had done something wrong. One researcher, interviewed in the 1980s by Japanese journalist Mori Masataka, described the frostbite experiments in clinical detail and then said, "We just had to be very careful. Careful. Not that it was wrong, not that the people on the tables were people. Careful. Careful about the experimental protocol, careful about the data recording." The word careful, deployed in that context, tells you everything you need to know about what 40 years of institutional ideology does to a person's moral vocabulary. The word that should be there. Wrong, terrible, and monstrous is not available. It was trained out. The word that is available is the word the institution provided: professional, careful, thorough. The scientists went home. The logs did not. Now let us talk about the dead. The victims of Unit 731's direct operations. The prisoners who died in the facility itself are estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 12,000 people. The range is enormous and uncertain because the records were largely destroyed and because the Soviets who captured the facility were not in a position to conduct a thorough forensic accounting. What we know is that there were victims. Many of them. They are largely nameless in the historical record. Partly because the records that might have identified them were destroyed, and partly because the communities from which they were taken were, and in many cases, themselves devastated by the war and occupation. The victims of the biological warfare deployments in China, the people who died of plague in Ningbo, of cholera in Zhejiang province, of the various other operations Unit 731 conducted in the field, are even harder to enumerate. Some estimates of total mortality attributable to Japanese biological warfare in China run to hundreds of thousands. Others put the number lower. The uncertainty reflects the difficulty of distinguishing deliberate biological warfare deaths from deaths caused by naturally occurring disease in a region under the massive disruptions of war and occupation. The perpetrators of biological warfare always benefit, in the historical accounting, from this uncertainty. A plague bomb release is followed by deaths from plague. The deaths occurred. The attribution remains contested. The victims of the Nanjing massacre, which was not Yamada's operation, which preceded his command of the Kwantung Army, but which was produced by the same military culture and ideological system that produced everything else in this episode, remain among the most contested figures in any historical atrocity. The Chinese government maintains that 300,000 people died in 6 weeks. Japanese nationalist historians have produced figures as low as a few thousand, arguing that the scale was exaggerated for political purposes. Most serious historical scholarship converges on a figure between 100,000 and 200,000. The range is itself a product of ideology. The lower you can push the number, the more the atrocity can be framed as a regrettable incident of war rather than a systematic massacre, or numbers as politics. This is one of the most reliable indicators that you are dealing with a war crime. The perpetrators and their defenders fight over the numbers because the numbers determine the verdict. The survivors of the Nanjing massacre and some of them were still alive in the 1980s and 1990s when serious documentary and oral history projects began to collect their testimony. Describe an experience that does not become less harrowing with repetition. They describe the days and weeks of the massacre in terms of specific incidents, specific streets, specific faces. They describe hiding under floorboards while soldiers move through houses room by room. They describe walking through the city after the soldiers had passed and encountering streets that looked different, quieter, wrong. The wrongness not immediately identifiable until you look down. They describe the smell of a city in which tens of thousands of people have died and the bodies have not yet been collected. They describe looking for their families afterward and not finding them. This is the specific human texture of what the Japanese military did, not the summary, not the statistic, the street, the house, the floorboards, the smell, the search, the institutional architecture that produced it, the ideology, the command culture, the Bushido doctrine, the three alls policy, sits at a remove from this specific human texture. That is the function of ideology. It creates the remove. It provides the language that allows the man writing the order to be insulated from the man carrying it out, and the man carrying it out to be insulated from the face of the person being killed. The remove is not accidental. It is engineered. It is one of the core products of the ideological and institutional apparatus we have been examining in this episode. Otozo Yamada lived inside that remove for 40 years. He was excellent at living inside it. He rose to the top of the institution that had built it. And when the institution was defeated and dissolved, and its leaders were called to account, he sat in a courtroom in Khabarovsk and described what he had commanded in the same language the institution had always used. The language of military necessity, of administrative function, of operational requirements. Because that was the only language he had for it. He had never developed another. In China, the memory of Japanese wartime atrocities is a living political force. The Nanjing Massacre. Memorial Hall in Nanjing receives millions of visitors each year. The exhibits include photographs, personal accounts, artifacts, and lists of victims. The same impulse that drives the Vietnam Wall, the Holocaust memorials, the Armenian genocide monuments. The conviction that names matter, that enumeration is a form of dignity, that the specific person who died deserves to be held in memory, rather than absorbed into a statistic. The Memorial Hall in Nanjing ends in a room with a wall of names. Carved into stone, column after column, the names of people who were killed in those 6 weeks in December 1937 and January 1938. Not all of them. There are not enough names in the record for all of them, but the ones that are known. The ones that can be asserted against the statistical anonymity that mass death imposes on its victims. In Japan, the memory of these events is more contested, more politically charged, more subject to the specific pressures of a national identity that built itself in the post-war decades on the experience of having been the victim of atomic bombing and on the constitutional pacifism that followed the defeat. The wartime atrocities are taught in Japanese schools, but with significant variations in how they are framed, how much detail is provided, and how much moral weight is assigned to Japanese responsibility versus the context of war and imperial ideology. Textbook controversies over how to describe the Nanjing Massacre have erupted repeatedly since the 1980s. The government's position on Unit 731 has been to acknowledge its existence while maintaining a level of official vagueness about the details that critics find troubling. This is not unique to Japan. Almost every nation that has committed mass atrocity in the not-too-distant past has developed, in the aftermath, a national memory practice that manages the discomfort between the historical reality and the national self-image. The management takes different forms in different places, but it is nearly universal. The specific thing that makes Japan's case worth examining carefully is the proximity of the atrocities in time. The grandchildren of people who experienced them are alive today. And the political significance of how they are remembered in the context of contemporary Sino-Japanese and Korean-Japanese relations, where historical memory is not merely an academic question, but a live diplomatic variable. What do we take from Otozo Yamada? He is not the most famous figure in the story of Imperial Japanese war crimes. He is not Hirohito, who will be debated by historians for centuries as to his degree of personal responsibility. He is not Hideki Tojo, the prime minister and general who was tried and executed at Tokyo, and who has become, in both Japanese and Western memory, the face of the militarist government's aggression. He is not Shiro Ishii, the founder and original commander of Unit 731, whose story has attracted more historical and journalistic attention than Yamada's, partly because Ishii is a more viscerally disturbing figure, a scientist turned mass murderer, and partly because his immunity deal with the Americans is a story with ongoing moral resonance. Yamada is, by comparison, almost bureaucratic. He is the administrator, the commander, the man at the top of the chain who received the briefings and signed the authorizations and continued the operations. He did not invent any of what he oversaw. He did not personally design the experiments or mix the plague cultures or fly the biological warfare missions. He commanded the command that did these things, and he commanded it competently and efficiently, and he went to a Soviet prison for 11 years, and then he came home and died. This ordinariness, this administrative, procedural, but uninflected quality to his involvement is what makes him worth focusing on in a series about the architects of imperial atrocity. Because the Yamadas of history are more common than the Ishiis, the world produces more administrators than it produces scientists willing to perform surgery without anesthesia in the service of military research. The world produces vastly more people who receive briefings and sign authorizations than it produces people who conduct the operations those authorizations enable. And the administrators are, in some ways, the more important moral problem, because the administrators provide the legitimacy, the organizational structure, the chain of command, the institutional cover, without which the operations cannot happen at scale. A unit of researchers working without command authorization is a criminal enterprise. A unit of researchers embedded in a properly authorized military command, with a chain of accountability running from their laboratory benches to the desk of the commanding general, is a military research operation. The same activities, the same deaths, the same atrocity, but framed entirely differently in the institutional architecture of accountability. Yamada was the man whose authorization made the difference between a criminal enterprise and a military program. That is what command authority means. That is what he provided. The memorial in Nanjing receives, in a normal year, more visitors than the Louvre, more than the British Museum, more than most of the great tourist destinations of the world. And it receives these visitors not because of its architecture, not because of what it contains in terms of art or artifact in the conventional sense, but because it is a site of witnessing, a place where people come to stand in the presence of what happened and to acknowledge it. The lists of names on the walls, the photographs, the personal effects, the survivor testimony played on screens in the exhibition halls. There is a room in the memorial that contains, in the floor, a pit filled with the bones of massacre, victims found in excavations on the site. You look down through glass at the bones. The bones are real. They have been identified, as many as possible, as the bones of people killed during the 6 weeks of the massacre. See, they are not behind glass in the way that museum objects are behind glass, to be admired or studied at a safe aesthetic distance. They are behind glass in the way that evidence is behind glass, to be seen clearly, without distortion, as the specific, irreducible material proof that human beings were here and were killed. Every country that has committed atrocity has to decide, eventually, what to do with the bones, whether to name them or to number them, whether to make them visible or to bury them again, quietly, in the administrative language of historical distance, whether to look at the chain that produced them and trace it from the laboratory bench to the operational order to the general's desk, or to locate the atrocity and the madness of a few exceptional individuals who deviated from an otherwise respectable national project. Japan has not fully made this decision. The decision is still being contested in textbooks and in political speeches and in the diplomatic language that shapes the relationship between Tokyo and Beijing. The decision is being made slowly, imperfectly, with all the distorting pressure of contemporary political interests on the historical record, but it is being made. And the making of it matters, not primarily for the political relationship between Japan and its neighbors, though that matters too, but for something more fundamental, for whether the people who died in the laboratories and the streets of Nanjing in the biological warfare, strike zones of Zhejiang province exist in the historical record as human beings who were killed, or as statistics in a contested accounting. Here is where this episode needs to end, but not with a verdict. The verdict came at Khabarovsk, and it was insufficient, and everyone in the room probably knew it. But with a question, the same question that all of these episodes in this series are circling around from different angles. The question is, what does a society owe the people its institutions kill? Not the enemy soldiers, not the combatants, the civilians, the prisoners, the people in the laboratories and the cities and the fields who were not parties to the decisions that killed them, who did not vote for the ideology that determined their fate, who did not belong to the institutions that processed them as raw material. What does a society owe them? The minimum answer is acknowledgement. The minimum is, we know this happened, we know it was wrong. We keep the names. We do not allow the numbers to be reduced to comfortable obscurity by motivated political historians who need the atrocity to be smaller than it was. Japan has not fully met even this minimum. China's government uses the memory of Japanese atrocities for contemporary political purposes in ways that themselves distort the historical record. The American immunity deal with Unit 731 researchers is a moral blot that has never been fully reckoned with. The Cold War geopolitics that produced the partial accountability at Khabarovsk and the imperfect justice at Tokyo left enough unpunished that the survivors and their descendants have legitimate grievances about whether justice was actually done. But the minimum, inadequate as it is, matters. The names on the wall in Nanjing matter. The documents in the Khabarovsk archive matter. The testimony of the survivors who lived to describe what they saw, the bodies in the streets, the people dying of plague in their homes, the silence that follows mass death. That testimony matters. Because testimony is what stands between the dead and the administrative language that processed them out of existence. The logs, the raw material, the statistics in a mortality table. Testimony insists on the specific human being behind the number. It insists on the face, the name, the irreducible fact of an individual life that was ended by a decision made at a desk, signed by a man in a uniform, ratified by a chain of institutional authority that stretched from Harbin to Tokyo and back. The general who commanded that chain is dead. His army is dissolved. The empire he served is gone, replaced by a constitutional democracy that has, with whatever imperfection and political ambivalence, renounced the ideology that produced him. The world he inhabited, the world of divine emperors and racial destiny and the scientific sacredness of military power, is, in its specific form, over. But the questions it raises are not over. The questions about how institutions produce men who can sign the orders, about how ideology converts moral agency into administrative role, about how the people at the top of chains of command understand their responsibility or evade it, or simply do not think about it because the institution has given them a language in which not thinking about it is the professionally appropriate response. Those questions will be here long after Otozo Yamada's name is forgotten, which is why his name should not be forgotten. Remember it. The man in the Nagano mountains who studied his cavalry manuals and climbed his ranks and received his briefings and signed his authorizations and went to his Siberian prison and came home to die in the country he had served with everything he had. His name was Otozo Yamada, and the dead he commanded the machinery to create are still waiting for something like a full accounting. That accounting is still incomplete,